Okay, so hi, I'm Ling. I'm going to present Team 2's GRUEN. And Team 2 consisted out of Rishikesh from India, Judith and Mala from the Netherlands, Martha and Eileen from Germany, as well as Federico from France and Janish from India. And we mainly worked over WhatsApp and Google Duo, and we think that worked quite well. And we're here to show you our results. So we started off by looking at what the main problems were that we wanted to change, mainly climate change due to CO2 emissions, which has led to a decreasing biodiversity. We also found that there was too much waste, especially polluted air, because factories are emitting toxic chemicals, as well as polluted water, which has led to much of waste and chemicals being put into rivers, oceans, and lakes. We also saw a lack of nature and infrastructure within streets and cities. So one example of this would be that streets are mainly designed for cars rather than for pedestrians or cyclists. And this lack of nature within the cities has also led to the alienation of the people from nature and health problems, which we'll talk more about later. So a few points to general sustainability that we would try to include within our city would be reducing the consumption of animal products, mainly by encouraging regional eating, as well as, for example, having urban gardens, as you can see in the picture down there. We'd also incorporate carbon capture plants within the landscape of the city and trying to raise awareness for climate change and a change in energy production methods. To give you a short introduction on our main focuses, here is the video. One sec. Can you hear the audio?
Yes, we can hear it fine. Thank you.
Okay, so our video was made by Janish, so thank you for that. And it simply just introduced a few ideas. I'll focus more on those in a second. Here as well is our website, which had a few little posts on each subject, which we'll be talking about. If you're interested in something a lot, you can always read up more on that later. So as already briefly mentioned by the video, our green focuses were green spaces within the city and its outskirts, as well as waste and carbon neutrality. We focused on clean air and clean water or water management, as well as a change in infrastructure. So you may be wondering, why should we focus on green spaces? This is because we've seen an alienation from nature within the population, especially this disconnect is there within cities, which are made mainly for industry rather than for us humans, or else we'd have fruits and vegetables lying around everywhere. And this disconnect has led to people making unsustainable choices for their environment simply because they do not realize what impacts each of their choices have on their surroundings around them. So we want to try and raise awareness for nature and try and restore this balance within the population so that they make more ecological choices in every step of their day. Within the city, we'd incorporate parks as well as trees alongside roads, and also have schools be taught in parks so that children are able to learn in a green and peaceful environment. We'd also incorporate green buildings with urban rooftop gardens like this one you can see on the bottom right. Here we have the structure of our ideal housing block. On one half, the green side, you can see this would be the area for urban farming or rooftop gardens, whilst on the other side, we'd incorporate solar panels to gain energy. In the backyard, there'd also be a green area filled with trees so people can simply relax after work or spend their time in nature a bit. To our city structure, due to this ideal housing block type style, we'd have a very grid-like structure. And we'd like to have a variation in building design, so we'd incorporate architects as well to make this basic design a bit more interesting and accessible to the people. We'd also try to have parks within 10 to 15-minute walk distances from nearly every house within the city, so that people are able to simply sit somewhere and relax, or maybe practice yoga in groups or have community meetings to come up with new ideas for the city. On the outskirts, we'd have a green belt around the city because the city has a high population density, which we'd also need efficient farms for. So there would be a subsidy for farmers and better so that they could afford better equipment. There'd be regulations in rotating crops so that the soil doesn't get depleted. And we actually thought quite a bit about GMOs, and we think they'd ideally not be used, but maybe in some cases for animal produce. As already mentioned, with the green belt, there would be a forest around the city, which would help to reduce CO2 and also be accessible to the people to simply come on the weekends and have a safe space or a place where they can focus on their mental health and simply regenerate after a week of work. When it comes to waste, we focus mainly on recycling, and non-recyclable waste should get used as biomass to create energy. We'd also try to decrease the amount of packaging, and if we do include plastic within our economy, we'd have plastic made out of corn or sugar beet because this is actually biodegradable. When it comes to carbon neutrality, we put a focus on transport, especially efficient public transport, which should be powered by electric or hydrogen vehicles. We'd also incorporate electric cars and promote rental cars as well as rental bikes, and generally the use of bikes and sources that don't consume energy within transport. And we'd of course try to reduce the amount of fossil fuels used. So that leads us to sustainable energy. Of course, we want to use less fossil fuels, and we thought about nuclear energy, which, if it is on the newest technological state, can actually be okay and not destructive towards our environment. But we're leaning more to nuclear fusion, which uses deuterium and tritium and can be replaced with helium-3. Now, nuclear fusion hasn't actually been invented yet, but it's a great idea, especially seeing as it has no consequences towards the environment. We'd use wind energy as well as solar panels as well, and if it is possible, water and geothermal energy. Now, just to give you a few ideas again, we have the solar panels which would be incorporated on top of our buildings, and in this case, we have a nuclear energy plant. To focus on more clean air, we would want to plant trees and moss. These would be incorporated along the streets, as already mentioned, or in the form of parks and forests. As in case you don't know, moss is actually even better at absorbing CO2 than trees are, so ideally these should always be planted together. Factories should also be away from residential buildings and be able to filter out their toxic chemicals. And of course, promoting the usage of public transport and bikes reduces the amount of fossil fuels. We try to build more electric car changing stations, so this becomes a more attractive option towards consumers, and also incorporate carbon capture plants within the landscape of the city. When it comes to clean water and clean management, water management, we came up with a few ideas, mainly that we wanted to use blue, gray, and green water for different things. I'll explain to you what these are as well. Blue water is mainly the water taken from groundwater reservoirs, and we'd use this for everyday daily needs. For example, cleaning the dishes after eating or showering. And this water would then be briefly filtered, and when it's been used, it turns into gray water. After briefly filtering it, we'd use this gray water for toilets where there's no need for extremely clean water. And once that water, the gray water, has then been used, we'd try and filter this very cleanly so it can be reintroduced into the environment again. Ideally, we'd only use green water for crops, and green water is any form of precipitation that comes from the sky. And we'd also try to collect, for example, rainwater in large bins for urban gardens so that when it does get a little hotter, we're still able to water these gardens. We also focused on infrastructure, which would be including a lot of trees alongside of the streets, as well as having better public transport. We'd have wider sidewalks and try to reduce speed limits for the cars. There should be cycling facilities for cyclists and, of course, increase the amount of parks and green areas within the city itself. We also thought that we could upcycle the plastic waste and actually construct roads made out of plastic waste instead of asphalt or concrete. And we'd also introduce gravity lights into the streets, which are actually pretty cool. There's lights that produce light and electricity simply by the use of gravity, so hanging down. Now we come up with all these ideas, but we want to think about how we can incorporate that into the normal landscape of any city. So we focused on funding research for nuclear fusion, as well as encouraging community activities which involve nature to promote physical and overall health. This again combats the alienation from nature so that people simply make these better green choices. So school projects could also be planting trees together with moss around the environments of the school or again along streets. And school classes should be taught in parks so that children really get an appreciation for the nature around them and the green things that are important to them. We'd incorporate more electric car charging stations, which makes this alternative more attractive again, and have restrictions in cars, for example, no cars in the city center, or in general, a reduced amount of cars in the overall city, which would lead to this option of having a car being very unattractive. So people are more likely to take public transport or maybe a bike. We'd also promote environmental studies inside of schools. And we simply want to fight against people being so alienated from nature so that they're able to make more ecological choices and really appreciate the ecosystems and the environment around them. Thank you for listening, and thank you for this project.